Hello, everyone. Welcome to this final closing session of Beyond Bohm, Science, Order, and Creativity, Contemplation, and Creativity. I'm James Barbieri, Associate Program Director of the Parry Center, and I will be your host for today. So as a host, any problems, technical or not, just feel free to drop me a message in the chat. Before we begin, I just like to very quickly go through a couple of Zoom rules. I'm sure we all know them, but just a good refresher. First of all, if you could please mute your microphones during the discussion and Q&A, just to ensure good quality audio. But at the same time, if you want to turn on your camera, seeing everyone's faces and reactions is very nice to see that. Yes, and during Q&A and discussion, if you want to ask a question or make a contribution, you can use the raise your hand function on Zoom or physically raise your hand. And if I spot you, you can ask a question. If you're feeling shy, you can always write your question in the chat and I can read it out for you. Regarding the Q&A, just so we can allow everyone to ask their question, if you could please keep your questions short and focused. And if you could please reserve any follow-up questions until everyone has had their opportunity to participate, and then we can circle back to you. This one will have a slightly longer Q&A section, so I'm sure it will get to you all. And finally, all sessions are recorded for archival purposes and for you all. The recording will be available about 3 days after this session, so you should all receive the link then. So with that, I'd like to pass it over straight to the chair of this event and this panel, Lee. Welcome.
Thank you, James, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So happy to have everyone here, and in our closing session, it seems like we've been going for a very long time. And at the same time, it seems like it's just been a matter of days. A lot of strange and wonderful qualities that everyone has brought, not just all the people that have sat in the round tables, but everyone's engagement with Sutra and asking questions and making comments. Everyone's involvement with this is really, it's just been wonderful. And I want to thank everyone up front for all your contributions and your participation. Right, we're at the end of the Beyond Bohm program, but surely we're not at the end of what we can do with what we've been sharing. And that's really what matters. This is about working with human problems and difficulties that we have, and finding out what we can do to generate new qualities of life going forward. So there's no end to that. We're just at a temporary closing here. So a couple of things before we start our dialogue today. As James mentioned, we'll have a longer Q&A period than usual. And it's not just question and answer, it's also just comments. You don't have to have a question. You can weigh in with a comment if you like. So we're leaving extra time today for that. And the chat will be turned off during our dialogue. You will be able to communicate with James, but otherwise the chat will be off, and then it will be opened up when we begin the comment and question section of today. So what I would like to do just very, very briefly is recap some of what has been shared and passed on over these few weeks that we've been working with Beyond Bohm 2. So we started with Hester Reeve and her group, and there were so many wonderful things. What a way to start, really. And among those many things, Hester opened up this issue that creativity is not the domain of the artist, and artworks themselves, or even there, are not limited to people who are working and practicing artists, but this is something for everyone's life, this whole opening of human creativity. And she also brought out that for any of us, that creativity and engaging in artworks, both natural and man-made, can really open up whole domains of perception to us. And I think this is of critical importance, that if we're not doing that already and begin to do it, I think we can learn a great deal from that. And then also Hester shared with us this very strange and lovely idea from David Bohm of art of movement, in which the whole of one's life is a kind of process of harmony and fitting. So all these things were brought out right from the beginning. And then in our second session, which kind of addressed the convergence of David Bohm's work with that of Owen Barfield, what we saw, among other things, is that if we take those two men together, the span of almost 100 years, where both of them are imploring us to pay very deep and sustained attention to our collective representation, or what Leroy calls tacit infrastructures. And that both of them were very, very clear to point out that these infrastructures, these collective representations, they really run much deeper than we think they do. So that we may have very sincere and real ideas and feelings about wholeness and harmony, but way down underneath that, those collective representations are still set in place. And that our work, from their point of view, is to try to loosen up and dislodge those collective representations and see what comes in when space is opened up there. And then last week we continued with Leroy and the dialogue group that he brought together. And you know, it's hard to give even the slightest thumbnail indication of what occurs in these dialogues that have been happening for so many years. But to me, part of it is the feeling of tens of thousands of years of depth and wisdom and relating to the earth in sustainable ways. And the feeling of this flowing up like a well in that dialogue, to me, was really a thing of deep beauty. And as part of that, Melissa Nelson brought out many, many subtle aspects of seeds. So we had all together this deep reaching into the past, calling on ancestors and elders. And then when we think of seeds, we're looking to the future. So all of that was wrapped up in that dialogue. And then we had David and his group with this remarkable challenge in the title itself, Changing Consciousness, Changing Consciousness. So to me, what was brought out among many other things in that dialogue was, can we do this? Can we change consciousness? How does that relate to new perceptions? How does that relate to our collective representations? How does that relate to this deep wisdom going back tens of thousands of years? What does it really mean to change consciousness? And is that something that we can do? So David and his group were just marvelous in bringing that out. And then yesterday, again, what can you say? Beth and her group reached back into the lineage of dialogue, how these many threads kind of coalesced into what David Bohm recast into a new form and brought out and shared with the world. But not just reaching back really in order to go forward. And so Beth very remarkably laid out this image of reaching forward, this evolution of consciousness, and this really remarkable horizon of possibilities that we could engage ourselves in new and different forms of dialogue, going in many different directions with many different possibilities. So that's brought us up to today and our group here this morning, this afternoon, this evening. So there was something in David's group last week that came out from Stephen Smith. He remarked on how he had at some point realized that he took his connection with David Bohm for granted. Not in a negative way, but it's just kind of human nature that you take certain things for granted and take certain people for granted. And that really struck a chord in me, because the same thing happened for me, that you relate with someone in a sustained way for many years, and you then begin to take that for granted. And so I was thinking about that and thinking about what Leroy had brought out very pointedly with ancestors and elders. And all of that together just left me feeling that even though we're looking to go beyond Bohm, we couldn't do that without Bohm. And so that's what I would like to focus on today. Bohm's work, absolutely, but also Bohm the man, for those of us who knew him and for those who didn't, to have a look at what kind of impact he's had in a personal way. So that's really my question that I would like for us to take up as a group here this morning. In what way, for each of us, did our engagement with David Bohm, whether we knew him personally or not, in what way has our engagement with him affected our life? In what way has it entered into who we are and how we think and how we feel? So I would like to invite everyone to hold that question and speak to it. And if you knew David, certainly please bring in anything about your direct relationship with him. Anecdotally, anything that would seem relevant or meaningful to all of us. And we've got plenty of time, so you can be expansive. You need not keep it real short. So I would like to ask, because of his unique position amongst this group of working with David Bohm, both in physics, but also philosophically and inwardly, I would like to ask David to please begin and open up, if you would, David, how David Bohm has affected your life and how you live in the world.
Well, let me then talk just a little bit about my relationship with David and how it began in the early 1970s when I went to England as a postdoctoral student. And what stands out for me, amongst all the other things of the 2 years I was there was a conversation in the cafeteria at Birkbeck College, the physics department, and in which David was talking about our understanding, knowledge, and how we tend to have a sense that we live in a world that we know somehow. And scientifically, this is really impressed on us, that we have some significant understanding of our place in the world, and astronomy and biology and so on, and we do, but that understanding, we have the feeling, points to the essence. So we have a feeling that we live in a familiar world. And what he was pointing out was that this may not be the way at all. It may be that all our forms of understanding are limited. There are particular expressions that we use that work very well, especially if we've developed them very much scientifically and so on. But that in the end, we live in a deep mystery. And he liked to refer to Einstein, who considered it a mysterious universe and who considered it whole, the inner and the outer. He also liked to tell the story that of what Newton said at the end of his life. You know, Newton, you know, the probably greatest British scientist that ever was. And the end of his life, he said, "I do not know how I appear to others, but to myself, I seem like a boy playing at the seashore, now and then distracting myself with a prettier shell or a smoother stone, while all before me, undiscovered, lay the great ocean of truth." And to me, the feeling of that sort of encompasses what carried my relationship with Bohm all the way through. You know, the feeling of we're grounded in a great mystery, and whatever forms we use to operate in it, yes, those are tools, those are useful tools, and they're important, they're necessary. But in terms of the essence, and in terms of our relationship to things, then it's a great mystery. And so that points to the mystery outside. And he also, at this, you know, would then mention, I don't know what ancient civilization in which people felt that what they were was like not an individual, but a mystery that was continually unfolding itself. So mystery inside, mystery outside, one mystery, not two mysteries. So that carried forward my sense of David Bohm. And I mean, there's much more after that, but that was the beginning. So I think I'd like to just leave it there for now. In appreciation of David. And I really think that that was at the root of his modus operandi. It wasn't ideas, it wasn't techniques of this or that or the other thing. I think it was an appreciation and feeling for that and what rose out of that. So I'd like to leave recollections for the moment at that. Thank you for asking, Lee.
Oh, thank you so much, David. And we'll likely loop back around. And if there are further things you want to bring in later, by all means, we'll have that opportunity. So thank you. I would like to ask Hester if she would be willing to share her thoughts and experiences in any way, Hester, working with whatever you've engaged with David Bohm and his work, and how that really has entered into your life.
Well, first, I think I'll start by saying I met David Bohm in a dream. I'd always wanted to meet him in a dream. I don't often dream of people I know. And interestingly, I met him in a dream just before I started working with you, Lee, in the first Hollow Flux series, which I just think is quite interesting, given that tuned me into the body and Bohm, which I hadn't got enough of until then. And the reason I want to share the dream is because there is something about, well, I don't know, it just really matters to me. And I think it's not what you would think, being somebody who really is very much committed and amazed by dialogue. So I could talk about that as well, that discovering dialogue, both as a philosophy and a practice, answered so many curious questions I had as an artist. How can you be an artist if you don't care about the non-human world? That you just can't be an artist and not care about the non-human world. How I know my blossoming happens in a studio. It just does. When I'm painting, making a drawing, it's like the world purrs and I know that something important is going on, whether the drawing is useful or not. But you can't stay in the studio and make those images that help you blossom when you know everything else is not blossoming. And it's a difficult thing to talk about, because who am I to say, particularly as a white woman, who am I to say, oh, the world, we've poisoned it? But that has always been deep in my spirit since I was a very little girl. And I would look at people and I would think, we're just doing it all wrong. It's like I used to imagine these little candles inside people's heads and just think, if only I could just blow and the candle would go bigger. So there's obviously some innate thing in there about the potential of liveness, and that came out beautifully through the people on my round table, that there's something about that. But anyway, the dream. So I've done a lot of the best dialogues I've been involved in have been very private, tiny little things in galleries or on landscapes, usually with artists, not necessarily. But I've also been involved with some of the people in England who work in a more corporate manner and who do very good work, but it's caused me great consternation individually. And I probably should have been far more honest and braver and never really been involved in that work. But you have that sense of I must be socially responsible. And actually, I wasn't being socially responsible. I mean, that's an interesting question. What does it mean to be socially responsible when culture is so complicated and problematic? In the dream, David Bohm was standing by the door of a very big wooden panelled, important Oxford University-ish sort of room, the legitimate knowledge, the authorities, the institution, and all the men, and they are usually men, all the men in England who are part of these dialogues were going in for what was going to be a very important dialogue. And I was very excited because I was also going to be part of the dialogue. And I was going to be in a dialogue with David Bohm. And he was really gentle. His atmosphere was very, very gentle. And he had this little yellow woolen waist jacket on. And I was the last one in. And as I gently walked in, he just very gently walked up to me and took me by my elbow and led me away from the room and just said very gently, I just want to eat soup with you. So I never got to do dialogue with David Bohm, but there was something about that meeting and that sort of very, I mean, he has this amazing ability to be very simple. And I don't mean that in any patronizing way. I mean, this is something I don't know how, I think it's important. I mean, his work is very complicated. I'm not in any way saying it's not. And I try to read the physics, I can't get there. But he does manage to hold the pebble in the river and let you feel the pebble with the water going over it in the way that you think, yes. And then it's hard to talk about because it's so implicitly right, or because I suppose now I'm starting to read Barfield, you've really participated. He allows you to participate in that. So I have to say as an artist, it's deep sustenance, because as an artist, and maybe I'm just oversensitive, I haven't really felt a place in culture, and I've had to really have a lot of armor, and when I'm not a very confident person for all the right reasons, have to proactively put myself in a position, because you have to, because this is the world we live in, but actually feeling really would rather be in the river holding a stone. And in my culture, it's very difficult to navigate that. I think a lot of people know what I'm talking about. And I also don't know whether it's due to neurodiversity and issues like that, but it's like, it is something that harms me. And then when I started reading the work of David Bohm, it just answered to so many things, my ecological sensitivities, and how I'd been working with the protest movement, I'd been working with environmental philosophy, all important things, but none of them quite got to the source. And then I realized, actually, you can't tell people to love nature. You can't do that. It's there. It's already there. It's already the stone in the hand. And that maybe, at least in my culture, dialogue is a way that opens that up. And as an artist, this notion of art and movement, this notion that although I've always loved making artworks, that's my phenomenological thing as a particular, but always knowing that this artistic process was far beyond that, and that it is not something you can control, and it's not a craft. Yeah, I'm just blown away by it. And I'm just, Lee, you said something in Beth's session yesterday that I think links to it, when you said, how do we enter this process as a living myth? And I thought, yes, I mean, art and movement is not something we can grasp, I don't think, because David Bohm says, all is art and movement. But I think at this point in the history of being and consciousness from a human perspective, art and movement does really call for something like that. So, and then just lastly, it's so important. I love being particular. And I think a lot of people are very scared of losing that identity, but being particular is not an identity. And that energy you get from really resounding as an individual, being alive in the moment, and then having to take on board that there's all this mystery in the cosmos that's right above your head all the time, and dramatically so at night. And again, it sounds so simple and innocent. It's profound. And there's something in all of David Bohm's work that finds a really eloquent, sincere, and also it's not that it has to be academic, but given I am working in academia, it really does help you talk about those things without people saying, oh, that's just hippie, or that's just this, or, you know, no, there's no such thing as the subject, you know, all of these very important intellectual questions that somehow really miss the point because they've been developed in a wholesale, uncritical questioning of the verbal, literal culture we belong in. So no, that's as much as I can say. And the dream is just the best thing that ever happened to me.
Thank you so much, Hester. I'm delighted that you brought in the dream. It really helps fertilize very differently what we're opening up here. Thank you. Beth, could I ask you to keep us going here?
My technological skills were keeping me from unmuting, but that's kind of how I'm feeling right now too. Well, thinking about the mystery that David spoke of, that is just so touching. I mean, it is so full in David Bohm, the mystery. And I'm thinking and listening to Hester right now, how huge of a span there is between that mystery and a little person, you know, and right now I'm thinking of the little person me. What a huge, huge gulf that seems like. I could say there's lots of ways I've tried to, in my own world, breach that huge gulf. One way that you'll probably think it's absolutely silly, but sometimes when I get really stuck, I make believe in my imaginal realm that I could have a dialogue. This is kind of like Hester's dream, but I make believe that I could have a dialogue and I can invite whomever I want to be in my dialogue. So I've got something I want to ask them about and I can't figure it out. So every now and then I might have David Bohm, well, almost always David Bohm, and I might have Aristotle or Socrates show up, or I might have Shakespeare show up. And I pose my question, and of course they don't talk back exactly. But then what I hope for is that something comes into my imaginal space, something that helps me with that. So that's one little thing. But really, what really touched me the most and helps me with that in thinking about David Bohm was when I was trying to do some writing about him, I had run onto some psychologists who talked about theorists, and they were talking here, people like Jung and Freud. They said that a theory that some of these people produce comes out of their unrecognized, unhealed wounds from early on, that oftentimes these wounds are so deep that they continue to fester, but they set the mindset so firmly that they open up a whole area of query that actually, in the end point, benefits all of humankind because this person has grappled with it all their life. And then there's things that come out of that early wounding that show up maybe as their theories, but they're so important. So it on one hand, it validates some of the dramas and traumas that these people go through, particularly David Bohm. Well, that made me really curious. So I began digging into Bohm's own history wherever I could, kind of collecting vignettes. And I saw him as being such an incredibly wounded little boy that it just pained me being able to feel the fact that he would, in his very earliest going to school days, describe himself as, I already knew I wasn't right because there'd been so much damage done to me and my family. That just wounded my soul, thinking about a child that age. Oh, feeling that wounding, still does. Still does, big way. But then for him to see the mystery he did out of that, it's just so incredible. For him not to have lost himself and been a sacrifice. Instead, he stuck through it, and look at what came. Now, I don't disagree that he was brilliant anyway. I don't mean that. But I think that he directed his way of living in a way that let the beauty that was there come through him. And what an inspiration. What an incredible inspiration. And I was thinking about how that kind of bridges, in a way, between this gulf I was saying that seems to be there between the mystery and a person. I think he bridged that gulf partly out of the void that he had experienced in his life. I think, I don't know, I think that's so incredible because he, in one hand, it validated the little person, us little humans that are on this earth plane, that in fact we can in some way bridge our own dramas and traumas and make something that's very valuable in this realm and perhaps other realms that really carry something. That's enough.
Thank you, Beth. I love your imaginal dialogues. I look forward to experimenting with that myself. That's really, really lovely. Thank you. Melissa, would you carry us forward?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for all that rich sharing, and the kind of the raw emotion that we're feeling. And thank you for that vulnerability. When James put that photograph of David up, David Bohm, I was kind of expecting one of the usual photos of his, professional headshots. And when I saw that, it just took my breath away. That's such an incredible photograph of him, and brought back just such a flood of memories and, felts, and of just time with him, and those eyes, and that openness to mystery, that looking to the mystery, beyond his personal infrastructures and him as an individual, to that cosmological realm. So thank you, James. That really set the tone for me with that image of him. And your beautiful question, Lee, to really reflect on those early encounters and the seeds that he planted in me. And that image of his wide eyes, and really connecting that to the Newton quote of being on the shoreline and standing on the shoreline, and feeling like, those little pebbles and shells that we can gather are so beautiful and so particular and so present and tangible, and how they just open up this whole other realm to the mystery that is beyond us, and the humility that he had, and all great thinkers have, right? To keep looking to the vastness. And it reminds me also of, the native traditions that we spoke about last week a bit. And in the Ojibwe tradition, one of our teachers, Nanabuju, one of his other names is walking on the shoreline, and to walk on the shoreline. And that's also translated in our language as one who makes good laws. And that is about walking on that shoreline, much like that image behind me, that you're always kind of balancing between something solid like earth and something very mysterious and liquid and dangerous, and beautiful, like an ocean or a lake that you can just fall into. And so somehow there was this connection of walking that shoreline of mystery, the known and the unknown, something solid and something very liquid and mysterious. And that's kind of the best we can do, is walk that shoreline, what Uncle Leroy calls surfing the flux, which I hope you can elaborate on as well, that it's a profound dance. And to see David Bohm do that dance in the circle with us, it just opened my eyes. I was a 19-year-old college student, and I read the book Dialogues with Scientists and Sages by Renee Weber. And they all touched me very much, but it was the dialogues with David Bohm that just opened up something in my mind. And I started looking into it, and lo and behold, he would come to Ojai and have dialogues right in my backyard there in Santa Barbara. And I just was so elated to find that, and started to go to those dialogues where I met Lee and Heather, who's on the call, and Richard Berg, and so many of you beloveds. And I remember sitting in the Oak Grove after his discussion of time and the ending of time, and the way the trees swirled around, and I became part of those trees, and I became, yes, the forest. And I'm sure many of you have too, at that exact spot in Ojai. And so David really shared with me that profound ending of time concept and dance in such a beautiful way. And the art of listening and the layers of listening, when there would be, you know, that, pardon me, but that one kind of annoying person in the circle who just would kept interrupting and asking the same questions, or repeating, or interrupting David. And, you know, half of us would be getting our rile up and like, oh, can this person be quiet and listen? And David, just with such humility and kindness and love, just keep listening to that person. And what a lesson for listening, and just the layers of listening, and continuing to suspend those tacit infrastructures and those assumptions of division. So I just feel so grateful for the seeds that he planted in me and in all of us, and that his spirit lives on in such a powerful way. And it's been implicit in me for decades in my different work. And it's just been fun to use that centrifugal force with his dye experiment with the implicit and the explicit. And, you know, the dye has been implicit in me and in my work, and kind of to circle around the other way and see the droplets of him come out more explicitly again in my work. And this vocabulary has been a real gift. So I'll end with that for now. Thank you, Miigwech.
Thank you, Melissa. Once again, bringing us this very powerful, potent imagery of seeding and what that can mean at many levels. And your lovely image of the river and the bank, which continues to come up in various places throughout these weeks that we've been together. So something is percolating with that image. Thank you. So Leroy, would you keep us moving here?
Yeah. I want to, of course, say good morning, good evening, good day to everybody that's online and to our group here. And very honored to speak about David Bohm. Let me preface what I want to say about David with the following. You know that in the past few years, we've been working on buffalo restoration. And we finally came up with a buffalo treaty back in 2014. Leading up to that buffalo treaty, of course, we engaged in what we called buffalo dialogues for 4-5 years or so with elders. And eventually the elders said, I think we are of one mind, and I think we want to have our brother, the buffalo, come back. But we need partners. We can't do this by ourselves. And we'll have to go and seek out partners. Okay. Well, I have always been interested in science. I've always been interested in science. But as usual, it takes a little while to be able to articulate the thoughts and so on. And as you mentioned at the beginning, that those foundational bases underneath let me put it as the everyday talk. There's those underneath foundational basis. Well, at the University of Lethbridge, there was a group of us that started to talk about Indigenous science. And it was at that time that I came across a definition of science by my former drinking partner, Einstein. Now, and his definition was, science is really about a search for reality. Science is a search for reality. As you know, a lot of people mix technology with science. Technology is really just the application of what we've come up with in science. Technology, so from that definition, technology really is not science. Science is really trying to stretch the envelope of what we as humans really know. See? Well, in talking about science, we had a friend, a colleague from, his name was Sam Canuso. And Sam told me, you should read this one book by David Bohm. And he gave me the book about wholeness and the implicate order. And I started reading about David Bohm's ideas in that book. And they said, hey, he's speaking like a Blackfoot Indian, And after having gone through the book, I was in a coffee chat with Sam. I said, geez, I'd love to meet this man, And he says, geez, I know another scientist who has worked with David Bohm, who lives in Ottawa, Ontario. And his name is David Pete. And maybe we can trace David Pete down. Well, we started looking up David Pete, and sure enough, we got a contact number, and we called up David Pete. And sure enough, hey, yeah, we made contact, and we said, hey, there's a small group of us over here that are wanting to have a dialogue on Indigenous science. Would you like to come and join us? And he said, sure, we'll be glad to come and join you. And so we did have our dialogue up there in Banff. And it was from there that David Pete made contact for us with David Bohm. And Pete said, he's coming over to the farm. Would you like to go and meet him? I said, of course. I dropped everything, and I went over and had my first in-person meeting with David Bohm. And I went for, as they usually do, went for long walks with him in the evenings, went in late into the evenings, talking about different scientific concepts, but the ideas in his book, such as the real mode that he was talking about, and so on. And from that, developed a dialogue with David Bohm at Kalamazoo, Michigan, And that's where, of course, I first met you, Lee. And we had that wonderful dialogue with elders and other scientists and so on. It was there that I knew and came to find out that let me just kind of segue over here a little bit. Coming back to my favorite scientists, Einstein. See, Einstein kind of was one of those people that first opened up the door with regard to quantum physics. See, but when he did open up the door and found out what was beyond the door, I think Einstein kind of got scared and did not want to go through the door, see. And, kind of stepped back. Well, David Bohm also got to that door. And he did open up the door and he went through. See, and just as at that time at Kalamazoo, when coming back to what Melissa was saying, hey, when we really got into those deep discussions, and the next day when we said, we've got to do a little bit of a dance, we're going to do a little bit of a ceremony, he joined us. And in fact, I remember very specifically when he took off his shoes. In fact, he took off his socks and we all danced barefooted and so on. I knew that he wasn't afraid to go through that door. See. Now, when I think about David, coming back to this notion of the Buffalo Treaty and how our elders were saying we have to develop relationships, just like we were talking about in our last session about the land relationships. Well, it seems to me, without having to articulate it, that's what was happening with David. We were developing relationships with him. And that relationship was very, going both ways, And we were able to talk about those scientific concepts. From a Western point of view, we were able to talk about indigenous scientific concepts from our point of view, and we were able to go back and forth with him at the Kalamazoo dialogue. So when I think about that relationship, and when I think about Western science and indigenous science, Western science coming from the whole notion of measurement, indigenous science coming from the whole notion of relationship, putting those two together and having a dialogue with David actually expanded the window through which humans can look into that vast cosmos that we're part of, as opposed to a much smaller window if we only looked at it through Western perspectives or from indigenous perspectives. If we put them together, hey, we get a much broader view. And it seems to me that was what was happening with David. See, and that's the impact that he had on me. And it seems that in the last few years, that's what we continue to try and make people understand. Hey, if we brought the two sciences together, we would have a much broader window to look through, a much broader understanding of that broad cosmos out there that we're part of. See, and that mutual relationship, that acceptance by him and our acceptance of his views and so on led to that example of what it could be when we bring the two together. That's the impact that he really had on me. Yeah. And it was all about this notion about relationships. Yeah. Let me leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Leroy. I think you've given us really deeply important way of how to think of David and what he offered in those last years of his life, this opening, this walking through that door, as you mentioned, and the meetings with indigenous elders and opening up something that really had not been opened up in a significant way before. It's so beautiful to hear you recount that. Thank you. Well, I'll pitch in a couple of things. I think, when I just think quickly of David without thinking this way or that way, what I think of is his generosity, which was boundless, really, to people he didn't know, to people he knew over and over again, as Melissa pointed out, to people that maybe even would harangue him. He remained generous. And part of that generosity was some kind of innate respect that in itself, it sounds strange to say it, but to me, that's mysterious, the depth of his respect, given so many things, the challenges that he faced and met throughout his life. And yet he maintained this incredible respect for people, for creatures, for the earth. It was always there and always available. So those are the qualities that I think of when I think of David. But in terms of how he affected me and impacted my life, when I did first meet him, one of the things that occurred over and over again in these various contexts where we would be together, often small groups of people of 4 or 6 or 8 for hours and hours on end. At that point, he was really interested in unearthing and understanding as fully as possible the self-world image. And the emphasis on this went on for years. And it was such a laser-like focus that he had, because he felt this was such an important thing that we try to understand. And yet it's very challenging, because so much of the value that we have invested in our lives is caught up in this self-world image. And so it's not easy. It can be very challenging. But there was something in his qualities of generosity and respect and humility that made that easier to do. So that, as I said, this went on for some years. And at one point there was a big shift. And that was when he started in these smaller groups, and then also in much larger groups of people talking about dialogue. And at first, those of us that have been working with him, we thought, what is this? What happened here? He went from one thing. And so there was some readjustment there and kind of reorienting toward this larger way of thinking of, as Leroy was saying, relationship. It's not just about you and becoming loosened and somewhat released, maybe, from the grip of the self-world image. It's about a much bigger picture. But then, just when that started to sink in, he brought in a totally different inflection into the dialogue, and that is participatory consciousness. So what could I say? There wasn't any resting in this kind of collective zone of dialogue with just among people, but there was this like a turbo propulsion into the totality, into the whole. And in relationship to the whole, to everything, to the whole cosmos, to the tiniest quark or muon, and to the utter vastness of the cosmos, such that we can apprehend it, and everything in between, all of it, all the cells in your body. So that was a really big jump. It was a really big shift. It was a really big challenge. Speaking for myself personally, there may have been other people involved in these sequences for whom it came very naturally, but it was just one kind of jump after another. And that's what I'm left with. Trying to find the words to keep it simple and short. It's something to do with maybe we can do this. Maybe not just think about it, but Right. Because that wasn't what David was about. He wasn't about just having ideas and concepts. He himself really did what he talked about. And I guess it was something in those qualities of humility and respect and generosity that infected so many people to come to the sense that whatever it is he's asking, whatever it is he's offering, this is something we can actually do. This is the, as David Schrum brings out, this is the change of consciousness. What does that look like? How do we go about it? This can be so variable from person to person, but that we need to do it, and that in fact we can do it, was something that Bohm believed right down to the soles of the shoes. So let me just thank everyone for what they've shared today. And maybe with that, we'll take, as Leroy said last week, a 2 to 3 minute break. And then we'll come back and we're open for questions and comments for the rest of the session. So 2 to 3 minute break and we're back.
Well, first of all, I'd just like to thank you all for that roundtable discussion. It was really beautiful. You really brought out the humanity of David Bohm. You usually think of David Bohm as, you know, a thinker, a physicist, his math, his writings, but not the person himself. And with the stories you've all brought up today, it really did bring Bohm's human side, which was beautiful. So thank you all for bringing that up. So yes, so we can now open to Q&A. I consider many hands up already. So just to allow as many questions as possible, if you could just keep your questions focused, and if you could just reserve follow-up questions so everyone's had the opportunity, and then we can circle back to you. So yeah, so if you can raise your hand through the reactions. I can see many have their hands up already, and we can start with Angelita.
Hello. Can you hear me now?
We can, yes.
Okay. So beautiful to see you all and to hear you all. And so I'll just start. I could go on for 5 minutes in the gratitudes, but I'll just say thank you. Leo Sinchiokwe Upesia. Thank you to you all. I think I'll start, David, by saying 50 years ago, I met someone who was one connection away from David Bohm. So, you know, I met Betty Friedan in the Sonoran Desert. And she was at that time organizing people to free women, I think she said. And so, of course, I needed to go and see who this lady was. At the same time, I received a book from a good friend of mine. I never say I'm autodidactic because I have many mentors, people who see me and say, you need to read this, or have you thought of this, or, you know, have pushed me and guided me and carried me along the way. So this classical physicist engineer friend of mine gave me a book. He said, I think this is written for you. So this happened as I met Betty Friedan 50 years ago. And the book was Physics for Poets. And it was very interesting. Betty Friedan told me, oh, I have a friend that you would meet. You would really enjoy talking to him. And then decades later, I realized it was David Bohm she was talking about. But to be direct, I was talking to her about the difference, now we would say, between equality and equity. And equality is firmly based in measurement, the science of measurement, or classical science. Equity is looser, it's in the flux. It's about responding to people, to communities, to buffalo, to plants, to other things. And I brought up a conversation that happened between Simone de Beauvoir, who we all know to be a European philosopher, lover of Camus, etc. And she gave voice to the most important thing for women to be free was to understand why we were all here. A very lovely existential, simple statement. And she was speaking to someone named Simone Weil. If some of you know her, W-E-I-L, Weil, Simone Weil, another philosopher and thinker. And Simone heard the other Simone, and she said, well, it's really clear to me that you've never been hungry. And I think that my meeting Betty Friedan, one connection away from David Bohm, and receiving my first book written in English about quantum science at the same time, put me on the path of both and. That I had been taught by my ancestors, and I continue to be held accountable to holding the partnership and relationships that Leroy talks about. We can't do this alone. Whatever we are doing in the way of changing consciousness or inviting Hester over to my house to have caldo, soup that is on my stove. I'm coming to you from my kitchen wearing my apron. I am a grandmother who always has soup on the stove, and there's something about soup that someday, Hester, you and I can talk about. But it's this idea that, as you, Melissa, say, seeds. I'm a midwife. You know, the original seeds are ovums that we carry, and we carry 3 generations within us and 3 generations ahead of us. The 7 generations are the seeds that we as women and grandmothers carry and are responsible and accountable for. So all of these things, I trust, and I, as Leroy says, I have braided together, you know, tried to braid together in my life over these last 50 years. And I remember reading Murray Gell-Mann's book, The Quark and the Jaguar, where he talks about the simple and the complex, and how a jaguar circling in the night is like a quark, subatomic quark circling. And I think he actually named quarks. And so I just wanted to share my connection to Bohm, because I actually met him later in a Quandaries of Quantum Physics course. And the professor was not really big on Bohm. He just handed it to me and said, he referenced the experiment you did, Melissa. And he said, I think this probably is just intuitive for you. And he was more interested in me learning other scientists. But braiding our knowledge, you know, is something I can't say to you how important it is that we learn from each other how to do this. And as I've been here at the table with you all at Paris, I'm full of hope. I generally, the past 50 years, have worked only with my own communities, the indigenous communities, and I don't share my knowledge, whatever that is, with other people outside of my community, outside of my land. But the elder Henrietta Mann just said to us, we have 10 years. And I think there was a scientific report of some sort that said the same thing. The earth is giving us 10 years. So it's time. It's time. And I want to say I'm open to learning from you, and I'm very hopeful that all of you find wisdom in Bohm and are studying Bohm and listening to the language of Bohm. He speaks my language too, Leroy. It's not Blackfoot, but he speaks my language. And I bring the ideas back at my kitchen table over soup to my elders. And, we have some really amazing conversations. And so I just wanted to say, this hope and this relationship that we're building here, the seed that Lee is giving birth to and that I'm witnessing here, is so beautiful and so very important. Where we can start, we've got 10 years. Where do you start? In the domain that we have control over, ourselves, our own thinking, our own acting, where we walk, where our feet are on the earth. Who are the original people there? What has happened? Hester, you referenced it. What's the history of the actual land that you're on? So I would advise, don't be afraid of being a Bohmian scientist in the land you walk, because I think that's what we have centuries of doing. Indigenous scientists, we pay attention to where we walk and how we walk. And we're wayfinders. There's no map. You can't get distinct data points from us. What you can get is a way of living. So I encourage you all, my kitchen table, in my apron, grandmother Indigenous science that I am, with soup on the stove. Go for it. You're on the right track. I'm so happy to hear you and see you and be here with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelita, for bringing that in. And it was great to have you last week during that panel discussion, well, that dialogue group. Would anyone like to respond, or? We'll move on. Thank you, Angelita. So next we will go to AJ and Adam.
Greetings, buddy. I thought our hand went up much later than everyone else. Surprised. I thought we had at least 20 minutes before we get called on. Oh, I just wanted to, I don't have a question. I mean, I do. They're not quite formulated in my ability to ask them yet. So I will save them for some other time perhaps. So I just wanted to just say thank you, express some very appreciative and encouraged gratitude. I'm very new to learning about Bohm and his ideas, his contributions. And listening over the past 3 weeks to the dialogues that have been happening and being a silent participant, like I said just a minute ago, leaving walking away very encouraged, feeling great encouragement. And looking at the iceberg, and seeing what's above the water and understanding that that's just a tiny sliver of what's there. And something that Leroy mentioned earlier about, the door and opening the door and having the courage not to be afraid. And that kind of reminds me of the iceberg. It's, having courage that knowing there's more there, but having the courage to go underwater, see it, experience it. And I'm grateful for the relationships that we keep talking about, whether they're on the cosmic level or not, for the intimate level with each other. That we be here to have these conversations and dialogue about relationships. And it's just been very refreshing and encouraging, and space to, you know, to be able to share and experience with everybody. So thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Oh, so go ahead, Aja.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'll try to be brief. I guess one thing that there's been so much, and some of the time, honestly, there's just been tears streaming down my face because so much is cracked open, and it's not necessarily sorrow or emotional in that way as much as just opening and opening and opening over these last few weeks and everything that's been brought forward. Just one reflection right now for me that I'm curious about is how we do work with dialogue and what has been offered, what has been given in that process, but then, as has been brought out in so many different ways, it's a process that could be personal with the cosmos, with the natural world, and with each other. And maybe the form, just kind of wondering about right now, is we honoring what we have been given in that process and some of the structure around it that's really cool. And at the same time, opening up, making it more inclusive in how we work with it and who can be part of it. Because I do feel like there is an aspect of it being very verbal and intellectual, and that we've been looking at other ways of knowing, other kinds of knowledge formation, other ways of working with each other in the world. So right now I'm really grateful for, and curious if any of you have thoughts about it, but also just an open-ended question. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Aja and Adam, for contributing. Did anyone want to respond?
I just real quickly, I think there's so many, thank you for your words. And there's so many ways to, like David used to say, engage in the spirit of dialogue within oneself, and that dialogue within oneself. And then I see you're in a partnership, and that's a great place to really practice these dialogue principles where the rubber meets the road, right? There's nothing theoretical or abstract or intellectual when you're who's making dinner or whatever it is. So my partner Colin and I have really found the dialogue process so wonderful to experiment and play with and deepen through relationship, whatever relationship that is, and then extending out to your circles. So there's many ways to practice it. That's just what I would want to encourage. And I'm sure you already are, but I really appreciate your passion for this inquiry. Thank you.
I would just echo what Melissa has said, that if you look over these past weeks, just in the containers of what this particular group has brought out in these different sessions, if you just limited it to that, and of course Bohm is by no means limited to that, but even within that, there are so many ways in, so to speak. There's so many ways that everyone has offered over these past weeks. And my own experience is that each person may have a different way in because of their own constitution. And certain aspects of what we've opened up may not resonate very strongly, but other aspects may resonate very strongly. And I think just following your intuition in how to open it up wider in your own life, I think that's a very trustworthy way to proceed.
I thought I saw your hand up. Do you want to come in or? No, that's okay. Well, thank you, AJ and Adam, for coming in and participating. Next, we will go to Manfred.
I was really touched by whatever I heard today and the weeks before, and it's very difficult to talk about David Bohm because he has so many aspects. But what really happened is that he changed my life in a very fundamental way. I started with Krishnamurti, and quite frankly, I did not understand him because I used my logical way of seeing the world. And I tried to grasp what he said, and I was not able to. And then I read Bohm, and it was completely different. It was like a good friend took me by my hand and went away from the logical part to the unknown. And it happened again and again and again. And I read Thought as a System, I think 10 to 15 times. And the strange thing was that I write notes in the book. And so I had so many notes in the first book, so I had to buy it again. And even the second book now is full. But what it made out of me is that I've learned I cannot grasp the whole. It's not possible. And that leads to a complete different understanding, not only of Bohm, but of Krishnamurti, about the native people, about non-duality. It's a complete understanding, and I'm so thankful and so grateful for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manfred, for sharing. Yeah,
I would come in on that, perhaps.
Yes, of course.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Manfred. Thank you, old friend. I cannot grasp the whole, but perhaps I can participate in it in the same way that I cannot grasp the ocean, but I can be in it and of it in that sense and move with it and know it that way. And so I think that in Bohm, there's an invitation to that journey. You know, Melissa talked about going along the shoreline, you know, in East Indian traditions, they talk about walking the razor's edge between the manifest realm and the unmanifested, the explicate and the implicate. So on the shoreline, on one side, you can pick up a stone or the pretty shell like Newton. And on the other side, there's fluidity. You may experience it as chaos because it's something that's beyond our control, beyond our grip. And I think perhaps there's a way of walking in life, whereas Angelita says, we're wayfinders, we don't have a map. But in fact, we do have a map. We do have the shoreline maps, but the shorelines will not unfold for us the story of the sea, which I think is the point that she was making. And they're both important. And I guess our challenge is to find a way to walk Melissa's, Melissa's shoreline. And what we're trying to do is do it together.
Thank you, David, for your contribution, and thank you, Manfred, for bringing that up. Yeah, so next we will go to Clara.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. It's good to see you all. I just feel so privileged to be walking amongst all of you today. Thank you. I'm kind of an outlier in this group. I'm a craniosacral therapist who, during COVID, started doing online sessions with people. And in our work that stems from osteopathic medicine, we believe that there are fields of energy, and those fields step down from universal fields into what we call a fluid field, and then step down into the body, the human body, where what we call potency is manifested. And I've been doing this work for a long time, and I teach it. And I signed up for this wonderful coursework. I don't understand why there aren't thousands and thousands of participants signed up here. It's just so important work. My curiosity is in understanding David Bohm's work, which I don't understand, but trying to resonating, I guess, with some of the principles about this way that we're all connected to one another and to nature and to the cosmos, and that it's all in here and it's all out there. It's all a relational field, let's say, which is very important in our work, in our healing work. We deepen into something called the relational field, where we settle into this place of a being to being connection instead of all this other stuff that comes in. But I found with this online work, as well as many of my colleagues did, that we were actually able, this is a light hands-on touch work that is a deep listening to everything that that human body is expressing. But what we found, along with many other, as I said, of my colleagues, is that we could actually tune into and feel the same things that we could with hands-on through this field of relationship of healing, like literally specifics of the vertebra or the cranial bones or the fluids in the body. So my question is, I know this to be true. I know this to be true. I know it's possible, as do my clients, as do the students that I teach, because they've been practicing it. My query is, how does this, how could, and because I don't understand physics very well at all, I'm much more, if you want to differentiate right and left, much more of a right brain person. How could this be somehow explained, I guess, is what how could this phenomena somehow be explained? I know it in myself to make sense, but how could it be explained? And are we that able to connect with one another through that type of distance and abilities? I believe it to be true. I guess I'd like some scientific, some scientific background or understanding of how it's possible.
David, I think maybe you could speak to that because of your background in physics.
Well, I think the most important thing to understand about science is that science knows much, much less than it thinks it does. You know, if we take seriously the views of science, that nature at least goes down to a very fine distance called the Planck distance. And this is where scientists are trying to unify all the fundamental fields. David Bohm pointed out then that if that is true, then scientists should take the implication of that, and I've said this before, that empty space is infinitely full. It's a plenum, not a void. and that each little cubic centimeter contains much, much more within it than is accessible to within the visible universe. Stars, galaxies, billions of galaxies or millions, and so on. So implicitly enfolded, if we take the science really clearly, is that we're living within an incredibly deep sea, which is so highly ordered that things go through it without being affected. And so we consider it emptiness. But experiments in physics show that you can break emptiness apart into anything you want. You can break it into an electron and an anti-electron, a proton and an antiproton. You always have to break it into two parts that are opposite each other. But emptiness is infinitely full. And then it's also been shown that it seems to be infinitely correlated. So science has not opened out that boundary yet. And so the answers to the kind of question you have may be something that are yet to be discovered. We live in great ignorance, really, not only of the outer world, but especially right there. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Clara, for bringing that in. I know there's some people in this. Oh, sorry, Beth. Go ahead, Beth.
It's a short edition. There's a researcher at UCLA in the medical school. His name is Alan Shore, and he's done some incredible work in synthesizing a lot of the research that's been done on brain processes. And one of the areas he summarizes is the relationship between an infant and mother. And the picture that I love, and I shared it yesterday, is an infant and mother gazing into each other's eyes. So he's looked at some of the research that's come about, and he said there actually is a verifiable sharing of information that's going on there. Now, that's just one little piece of what you're talking about. But I would say that some of these things are so real to us because they've always been there for us. And we tend to doubt them because we think science is the one that has to validate the knowledge. I think it's kind of what Angelita was saying. As a native scientist, she already knows a lot of these things, as do the other indigenous groups. So we have a little inkling of that. And if you're interested, if you look up Alan Shore, or if you want to contact me, I could share some of that with you. And I know Helen, I apologize. There was somebody who shared a link with me yesterday, and I forgot. I apologize. I've forgotten the name of the person. Anyway, there's some evidence that's coming about that, in fact, the transmission is possible. So, as David was saying, I think there's some validation other than through science, and that maybe science isn't the ultimate one that we need to look to for the validation. We need to look to you through science. I think that would be it.
Hester.
Just quickly, one, Clara, I think what you're doing, your work sounds amazing. So that needs to be said. And how interesting that, you know, through the pandemic and working remotely, that doesn't seem to affect that sensitivity and that registering of the energy. So it just, you know, it's mind blowing. And how phenomenally amazing is not just the world around us, but I think our capacities. And we've rightly talked a lot about, you know, the problematics of the self-world image. It's hugely problematic. But we must never, you know, what you're saying, you're doing that through your creatureliness, and creature and creativity, they're really, really closely related. And it just makes me think, you know, how incredible that we have this ability. I don't know if it was Dave in his session or somebody recently put it so beautifully when they just said, you know, we experience a lot, but our experience is nonetheless confined to our our notions of verbal language, but actually the brain can experience more than that. We as a registering instrument can experience far more than that. So there is something about the way we don't use our own capacities. We don't open ourselves up. And it's almost like, yeah, I think that only comes through practice. I mean, there's so much written about opening yourself up and the importance of that. And so many people so desperately unhappy because they're not open. So it is interesting how it comes back to this thing of having to do it, but it's what you are doing. So I just want to say, I think it's phenomenal. And then this notion of the brain, and it's David Bohm talks about the brain being able to open itself up like an antennae to more subtle levels of reality. And I think that's what you're doing with your brain. We should never underestimate the brain body and its complete connection within all this. So I can't offer you any science, but yeah, it sounds amazing. So thank you.
Thank you, Hester. Thank you. Thank you all.
Lee?
Let me.
Yes, just briefly. I just want to echo, because I think it can't be emphasized enough, that there's not a great deal of virtue, I think personally, in the tendency that all of us have, or most of us anyhow. It's pretty deep set. It's part of the collective representations. That if we can find some kind of validation in some kind of scientific arena, that is important. And I don't think it is. I think there are so many books out and about that having to do with inner work, and then it reference, well, quantum physics says this, and therefore this, and linking these things up in really very, very, very tenuous ways. And if there are correspondences and confirmations, that's very good. But I think we really need to dig deep and find a way to completely shake off the need for referencing any scientific methodology to what we're doing inwardly. And I'm not saying there are not ways that those can converse and interpenetrate. They certainly can, certainly. But in terms of our own daily life and our own inner work, however we want to frame that, the sooner we can loosen ourselves from needing to validate any of that scientifically, I think the better off that we'll all be. Thank you.
If I can jump in, I think to a large extent, our language, and consequently, I think why David Bohm was trying to find a different mode for the English language, which he was referring to as the real mode. To a large extent, our thinking processes, which is limited by the language we speak. And if you realize that, I should say, and think outside of that, so that, for instance, in Western science and quantum physics, we're still talking about the notion of matter, okay? Even to the extent we're talking about massless particles, see, the language is still talking in matter particles, okay? When, if you looked at it from, for instance, an indigenous point of view and thought about it in terms of energy waves, hey, it would look quite different. I'm not, I can't come up with really any exact answer, but it might look quite different if you looked at it from energy waves. That's what indigenous elders would refer to as the spirit. See. Thank you.
Thank you, Leroy. You took the words from my mouth, not that I've had much chance to say them. I wanted to say David Bohm, who I knew quite late in his life, spoke so warmly about you and his time with you and your friends. There's so much that's been said today I resonate with. I have a picture that I painted after a visit to Oak behind me. What sort of ancestor will I be? I'm speaking as a grandmother. I'm speaking as participatory consciousness. And my feeling is that the greater consciousness has us. What we need to do is open to it. And we do that together and through dialogue and other ways, but dialogue has certainly helped me. I did group work, sort of group work, before I met David at a conference. It was called the Human Unity Conference, and he spoke about consciousness, and that was in 1983. That inspired us to have other group work, other weekends. And when we went back to our home in the country, we invited our friends to participate in dialogues with us. And we didn't have any rules, but people just loved it, jumped into it. And from that, it has spread to quite a lot of other things. And I think about going through the door. Well, I experienced David as a very kind and humble person. And I couldn't talk to him about physics very much, but he said, intuition and imagination are really important. He encouraged me that way, so I learned to participate a bit more. But going through the door, I spoke to him the night before he died, and he said he felt he was on the verge of something. He was on the edge of something. And he felt to me like he was illuminated when he spoke. And he was on the edge of something. He was a very rich part of my life. And it's really nice to hear everyone speak about him.
Thank you, Anna, for contributing. Did anyone want to respond to this?
I did, James. It's lovely to hear Anna speaking. Hi, Anna, it's Sally.
Oh, speak up, Sally.
Oh, okay, I'll speak up. Is that better?
Yes, yes.
I just wanted to say something a while back in response to Angelita, because I knew David Bohm at Brockwood and around Krishnamurti, and I spoke with him in different contexts over a number of years. But what always in my mind goes with David is Sarah, his wife. And I really want to remember Sarah today as well.
Yes.
And yeah, I guess as a woman, I think she cared for him in a way that he perhaps really needed. And
yes.
She's very much in my mind today.
Yeah.
And I too, as Hester knows and David knows, had a wonderful dream of him recently. And Sarah was in that dream, and she had long hair, and she was flowing and full of life. And it was so lovely to see her in her majesty as well as him. So yeah. I just had to do that. I'm sorry to break in, but I really want to bring her here too. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally, and thank you, Anna, for coming in. Now, unfortunately, we are reaching the end of the Q&A as time is it's closing. I'm sorry for everyone who wanted to ask a question. We did try to get as many as possible, but thank you all for contributing. Now we do have a bit of a special closing for this session, and to close the Beyond Bohm program. Lee, did you want to sort of introduce, or?
Yes, thank you, James. Just to close us out, which feels sad that we have to end. It would be wonderful to go on, but for today we'll close. I've asked my friend Richard Berg to read us a poem. So Richard, whenever you're ready.
The poem is Keeping Quiet, Pablo Neruda. Now we will count to 12 and we will all keep still. For once on the face of the earth, let's not speak in any language. Let's stop for 1 second and not move our arms so much. It would be an exotic moment without rush, without engines. We would all be together in a sudden strangeness. Fishermen in the cold sea would not harm whales, and the man gathering salt would look at his hurt hands. Those who prepare green wars, wars with gas, wars with fire, victory with no survivors, would put on clean clothes and walk about with their brothers in the shade, doing nothing. What I want should not be confused with total inactivity. Life is what it is about. I want no truck with death. If we were not so single-minded about keeping our lives moving, and for once could do nothing, perhaps a huge silence might interrupt this sadness of never understanding ourselves and of threatening ourselves with death. Perhaps the earth can teach us as when everything seems dead and later proves to be alive. Now I'll count up to 12 and you keep quiet and I will go.
Richard, for
Thank
sharing
you,
that
Richard.
poem. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Richard, for sharing that with us. And lastly, I just want to thank everyone in our group today and our round table. And I want to thank Pari and everyone at Pari for making all of these amazing opportunities come to fruition. And most of all, I want to thank everyone who has joined in and participated silently or actively in any way. None of this would happen if it weren't for the renewed interest that people are showing in this kind of work. So, all to be continued. Onward we go. And thank you all so much.
Lee, and I'd just like to echo what you've said. Your thanks to all of the panelists here, Leroy, Beth, Melissa, Hester, Dave, and also a very special thanks to you, Lee. You have chaired this event. It's been really fantastic. You put so much work into this. So thank you really so much. And I'd also like to thank Eleanor, Jenna, and Maureen, the Pari Center team, for helping setting all of this up. Thank you for everyone here who's come to see us. It's been really amazing. Thank you all for your contributions. for all your messages that have been coming up. And of course, Sutra. All the things that have been shared there have been really fantastic. The Sutra channel will stay open indefinitely. So keep posting there, keep making those connections. So yes, thank you all for all of this. And just before we close, I'd just like to announce a few things that are coming up here at the Party Center, which I'd like to invite you all to. So the first one is next week on the 4th of September, which is the Ian McOgris session. He unfortunately couldn't make the What is Consciousness event earlier this year, but instead he is hosting and leading his session next week on the brain and our encounter within the world. It's a really special session. Look on our website, there'll be more information on that. And also we'd like to invite you to our next series entitled Exploring the Earth Mind, a series led and developed by John Briggs. John will be joined by special guests such as Robert Toth, Ophelia Ribas, Shantina Augusto-Sabadini, Director of the Party Center, and myself, where we will dive into the connection between our world and consciousness with a holistic approach rooted in indigenous knowledge and physics, quantum physics. This event starts on September the 11th for 2 weekends, so I hope you all join us then. As always, if you have anything to say to us, you can contact us through our website in the Contact Us section, or you can write us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Sutra, or even email us directly at james@partycenter.com to contact me, or Eleanor@partycenter.com to contact Eleanor. Thank you all again for this amazing series, and we'll see you again soon here at the Party Center.